Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Cross Question. It's the Monday edition. We're live at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Don't forget, if you want to ask a question to our panel, the number to call 0345 6060 973. And if you want to watch us, you can do so on Global Player, the LBC website, lbc.co.uk, the YouTube channel, Facebook or Twitter feeds. Let me introduce you to our panel. Salma Shah is former government advisor, regular on the programme, although you haven't been on for too long, have you, Salma? Andrew Mitchell is always on my programme because he's very good value, so we're looking forward to hearing from him, former International Development Secretary, and he's Conservative MP for Sutton Coldfield. And a debutante on the programme tonight, Samantha Smith. She is a Conservative youth activist and political commentator. So let's get on with the show. 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to David in Tunbridge Wells for our first question. Hi David, what would you like to ask?
Yes, good evening, panel. I believe many people, including possibly a majority of his own backbenchers, are lobbying the Chancellor to stop the £20 a week reduction in universal credit, principally because at least 3 million, if not 5 million adults and their corresponding children are on universal credit, many of whom are in work. Now, I believe, I may be wrong about this, but I believe the increase in universal credit cost £6 billion between April and September, whereas the furlough scheme cost £70 billion, I believe, out of a total annual spend of 900. Do you think it's justified to continue with this reduction?
Andrew Mitchell, this is something that a lot of Conservative MPs seem to be fairly anxious about. Somebody was telling me yesterday that if HS2 was abolished, you could fund this £20 uplift for another 17 years. What's your view?
Well, I'm not in favour of HS2 being abolished, but I have a very strong constituency interest in seeing it proceed because it will be enormously important for the future of the West Midlands and for Birmingham and for Sutton Coldfield that it goes ahead. So I wouldn't be in favour of that. But I do think that David is right to express concern about this cut. I was a social security minister, work and pensions minister in the 90s, and I had some responsibility at a junior level for benefits. And I know that it's extraordinarily difficult to take money off poor people, and we learnt then the hard way really that you can freeze future expectations, but removing money from people is extraordinarily difficult. So on the other hand, this was a temporary move, very sensibly done by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to help people out at a very difficult time, and it was always supposed to be temporary. So at the moment, I'm very much in two minds about this. We're very unlikely to get a vote on it, I have to say. What I would like to see is the Chancellor taking the edges off the poorest people on universal
But he had
credit.
the opportunity to do that today, and he didn't, did he?
Well, it's got some way to go before... it's got some way to go before final decisions are made on benefit spending. But if you were to target the least well off who are below what is technically defined as destitution level, you would be going for young people under the age of 25 who are inevitably on universal credit. They may be previously homeless, they may have left difficult backgrounds and homes, and I think if you were to do something to adjust it for that, it would make what was always a temporary measure, but which is now likely to be withdrawn, it would make it more palatable, I think.
Salma, you've been a special advisor at the Treasury. You know how these things work. Obviously, there's a lot of lobbying going on from Conservative backbenchers and many other interest groups as well. Do you think that, Boris Johnson might use his speech on Wednesday to announce some sort of initiative in this area?
I think the problem is when you have something like this, there's quite often a signal that comes out before a minister makes a speech or a decision publicly, and we haven't seen any signals on this. But I personally remain hopeful, as Andrew's just said, that we still have a little bit of a way to go, and perhaps there will be some accommodation made for those people around the edges that aren't necessarily, the working poor, as you can define them with the universal credit.
It's interesting, isn't it? This is not a sort of left versus right thing. There are people on, I would say, the real right of the Conservative Party who are expressing just the same interest as people on the hard left of the Labour Party.
Well, our electoral demographic has changed. 2019 completely redrew the political map, and therefore we can't have and we're seeing this throughout this conference, is that we can't have the same dynamic that we've always had. We can't just be the party of business, because we have these red wall constituencies that are dependent on us to think in a different way, and it is creating a bit of an intellectual difficulty which we haven't found a way to articulate properly yet.
Samantha Smith.
I very much agree with what Salma said. The voter demographic for the Conservatives has completely shifted over the past 2-3 years. I don't have experience in government of the universal credit system, but I have experience from the front line, I suppose. When I was 16, 17, I was homeless. I was claiming universal credit in order to keep a roof over my head while working 3 jobs to support myself and to keep food on the table while I studied through my A-levels. And I know from first-hand experience just how difficult it can be to scrape by on universal credit. I worked 35 hours one week, and I was looking through my old pay stubs, and I earned £130 for those 35 hours. And that was obviously taken out of my universal credit because I was working. So I think that it's about making employment more palatable, as Andrew said, and more realistic for people, especially those who are younger, who are maybe inexperienced, who are unskilled, and through introducing alternative schemes rather than teaching people to rely on handouts from the government, teaching them the power of perseverance, the power of support, and the power of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and making a living for yourself. Because I know that from my own experience, I was often told, why do you work? It would be much easier, and you would probably earn more if you weren't working and if you were just claiming universal credit. But
I think that's a really interesting point. And Andrew, this is a discussion that's been going on in the Tory party, well, in society in general, for decades. And universal credit was supposed to make this better. And it has, in a sense, that because I think before it was like 90% of anything that you earned would be deducted from your wages. It's now 63% or 63p in the pound. That still seems to be incredibly unfair in me. It's that there is a disincentive to work more.
Well, you're quite right about the debate that's been going on. And of course, the Treasury took back money from universal credit when Iain Duncan Smith set it up, and the £20 has put back some of the stuff that Iain wanted to see in it to make it better. But I think that Sam is absolutely right, and that she gave her own example, which I think is very helpful, because the people at the bottom who were in her position are the ones who are going to suffer, I think, most from this cut. But it was a temporary measure, and you don't want to say to the government when you come in to make a temporary measure to help people out at a particularly difficult time, that you can't do that sort of stuff, because of course it will be kept as permanent afterwards.
I suppose, Salma, the argument against that would be that, well, when it was brought in, no one knew that inflation would have rocketed, but gone up, and it's going to go up further. No one knew that the fuel crisis would happen, or the energy cost would be increasing so much. So you can see, if they wanted to justify a U-turn, it's actually quite easy to do.
Yes, and also I think structurally they're talking about, the Kickstarter scheme. We heard from the Chancellor today that they're expanding these jobs plans. But ultimately, structurally, the economy has to benefit that rhetoric. So if you want to say, and Sam, you're quite right, you shouldn't disincentivize people from working, but they have to have the economic structure where those good jobs are available for them to move off universal credit. And it's not true that all those jobs are available everywhere all of the time where they're needed. And I think that this is, well, in my head, this is what levelling up is supposed to be about. So you can't take people's universal credit away knowing, as you rightly point out, that prices are going up, inflation's going up, while still waiting sort of, maybe in 2 or 3 years' time to have those jobs that you are hoping these people on universal credit will go into.
Sam, something that you said there, I wanted to ask you about the demographic of this conference, which Andrew and I have been going to conferences since the 1980s, and this is a very, very different demographic here. I would say even 5 years ago that the biggest demographic would have been above 55s. The biggest demographic here is 20 to 40, isn't it? But there's a disadvantage here, because 90% of the 20 to 30-year-olds seem to be male. You are the exception.
Yes, I mean, it's fantastic the amount of progress that the party has made in opening doors for more young people, more people from diverse backgrounds, whether that's ethnic minorities or working class backgrounds, to identify with conservatism and to see a path in which conservatism can work for them. But we are still faced with a deep-rooted problem where the government and the policies that are being put in place don't seem to work for the majority. As Salma was saying, we cannot simply take away one thing without providing another alternative. I know with regards to having appropriate jobs out there, it's very difficult for a young person or someone who's unskilled without the financial or educational background to be able to succeed, to find jobs that will pay enough to make a living without relying on the welfare net. I think that as long as we don't have the policies in place to support those diverse backgrounds, we are still going to see an issue in the Conservative Party where it only caters to one certain demographic.
Andrew Mitchell, this is so different from a 1980s conference, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, I think that the challenge for the Conservative Party is this. Boris has brilliantly added on this DNA from the Red Wall seats with the challenges that both Salma and Sam have identified. The trick for the Conservative Party is to keep that coalition that David Cameron put together, which meant that in 2015, the Conservative Party, for the first time for 23 years, got a parliamentary majority. And that means keeping the internationalists and the people who care deeply about development in the Conservative coalition and not sending them off to either a newly formed Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats. Keeping that coalition is the challenge for the Conservative Party, and there are quite a lot of hazards in doing that.
Now, you've got a new book out at the moment. It's published, is it next week, I think, isn't it?
It is, but there are some copies at the conference in advance.
And I looked in the index of this book to see if I got a mention, and I get 6 mentions. I think you have rewritten history slightly in one or two of them, but to my advantage, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Well, we authors must stick together. Yeah.
And what's the book called?
The book is called Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. And it's not a politician's advice on utopia or self-justification or this is how you create the perfect world. It's really designed to make you laugh. And there's some serious stuff on international development and some stuff from when you and I were first involved in politics. But primarily, I'm hoping to amuse and entertain people if they buy my book. And I said to someone today, if it doesn't make you laugh, I'll give you your money back.
Oh, that's a very dangerous thing to do. But we will have you back to talk more about that book on a different occasion. But in the meantime, let's move on to a different subject in just a second. 0345 6060 973. Nikki in Sunderland, we're coming to you next. It's 8:15.
rather miss out.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:20 on LBC. With me in Manchester, Andrew Mitchell, Salma Shah, former government advisor, and Sam Smith, Conservative youth activist and political commentator. Right, our next question comes from Nikki in Sunderland. And Andrew, you've got a connection to Sunderland, haven't you?
I have. I was the parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives in 1983, before the other members of this panel were born. So I stood there as the candidate in that general election and fought hard, but I'm afraid the good people of Sunderland fought back and I didn't win. But
one of the few Conservatives not to win in 1983. Right, let's get Nikki's question. Hello, Nikki.
Hi. Can I just say something about that candidate that stood in Sunderland? I can't even remember him, to be honest.
Oh, are you old enough to? Andrew Mitchell is his name.
It's so long ago.
I'm 56, so I would remember his name.
You would.
Yes.
You were at school.
The question is, I feel like the Conservatives are burning their heads in the sand over the Sarah Everard case. How are we going to make the streets safer all over the country for women? And I'm speaking this from personal experience myself.
Okay, Sam, let's come to you first on that. I mean, these terrible cases, Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa as well, that we've been reading about in recent days. How have they affected you? And I mean, do you feel safe when you're sort of out on your own, walking in the street?
You know, Nikki, I can absolutely sympathise with the fear that clearly comes over in your question. I know that personally, walking alone at night, even in a small village, it can be absolutely terrifying. You have your keys in between your knuckles, you have your safety alarm, you have your phone with 999 dialed in just in case. You're constantly texting friends saying, here's my live location, this is where I am. And that's because although the media...
Do you seriously do all of those things?
Genuinely. It's something that women do, and it's just normal. It's a normal part of our everyday lives. It's a fear that we have come to accept as, you know, an unfortunate byproduct of being a woman. And I think that what isn't helping is the rhetoric that is coming from, unfortunately, some of our own PCCs, some of our own
that's police and crime commissioners.
Police and crime commissioners saying that perhaps women need to learn a little bit about the legal process and that it is our duty to not submit.
To be fair, I think that was only one.
Yes, it was only one, but I would say that where there's smoke, there's fire. And as I've been Conservative since I can remember, I absolutely believe in the government's promises to make the streets safer for women. But as long as we have these toxic influences within our own ranks, how can we claim to be the party of justice? How can we claim to be the party of safer streets? And as a young woman myself, I want to see real action to tackle this so that we don't have another Sarah Everard, we don't have another Sabina Nessa. I don't know whether you know, but over 80 women since Sarah Everard's case have been murdered where a man is the primary suspect. And this is something that, like I said, is an unfortunate byproduct of being a woman nowadays. You don't know whether your trip out to the shops is going to be your last. You're not sure whether taking that shortcut home will end in tragic consequences.
It's appalling that anyone should have to think like that, isn't it, Salma? Do you?
I have to say that I don't think like that, and I think it's because we didn't talk about this kind of stuff as much when I was younger. I don't think it's because the threat didn't exist. I think it's because a lot of us, I'm not as young as Sam, I'm approaching my 40s, and I think that when I was a lot younger and going to university, we didn't talk about misogyny as an aggravated factor in crime, and we certainly didn't talk about feminism in the way that we do now, and certain rights in the way that misogyny is embedded culturally in a lot of situations and scenarios. And I think that knowledge is both liberating because we can talk about it and we can really actually get to grips with some policy perhaps in government that's going to deal with it, but also it's a recognition of the fact that all those things that have been bothering us that we worry about, they are out there and we actually all do feel them in a way that like I say, I don't think was true when I was younger. I do think it's interesting, what Nikki's asking, because we have this issue in society much more generally, but we've seen it transposed in the police service. And I think that's an interesting question about how, those people who are supposed to protect us, how sort of how embedded this view is in that service as well, and it really does shake your confidence in the system.
Andrew Mitchell, this is primarily a male problem, isn't it? Because if men didn't act in the way that they do, Sam wouldn't have to feel like she does.
I'm afraid it is. And Nikki, thank you for your question. And I think you speak for millions of women across the country. I would like to say three things, and I'd say it against the background of the fact that the vast majority of police officers are honest and decent people trying to do a good job for their local community. I think there are very select and special problems with the Metropolitan Police, and that's why I called yesterday for a public inquiry into this, along the same lines as happened with Stephen Lawrence. Half the country are women. I think very, very large numbers want to see a public inquiry, and what the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, whose resignation I don't think we should call for, I think we should seek to get her to sort this out, what she has said today is a good start in terms of an inquiry. But that brings me on to my second point, which is that we cannot any longer have the police policing themselves. All the independent structures policing the police are not really independent. Many of them are staffed by former police officers. We must ensure that the police no longer mark their own homework. And I think we should have far greater transparency and a really tough policing of the police, which is independent and which is effective. And the final point I would make is this. I think that when Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, goes, if at all possible, her replacement should not be a police officer. I think it should be an outstanding leader who has real experience of leading large and difficult organisations. In the past, a long way in the past, it has been a senior military officer. I think there's a very, very strong case for the next leader of the Met not being a serving police officer.
I mean, is your view on this coloured by your own experiences with the Metropolitan Police? I mean, people will remember the so-called plebgate issue, which you were obviously involved in, and I mean, there was wrongdoing in the police uncovered during that, and that must have seared you.
Well, it all ended in a mess because I lost the libel case, but very large numbers of police officers, 10 or so, were disciplined, several were sacked, one was sent to prison, so it ended in a mess. But what I'm trying to do is to use that experience positively to show how we could make some progress, and that's why I mentioned those three things. I would also say that at the time I had all that difficulty, pornography, described as severe pornography, was found on the phones of the Diplomatic Protection Group, and certainly, as I understood it, that was one of the things that was going to be reformed and cleaned up. And it's clear from what we have learned recently that that particular group, the Diplomatic Protection Group, is still behaving in that way.
That was what Wayne Couzens was a serving officer in.
And I think, as a matter of urgency, the police need to clean up that grouping.
Nikki, thank you very much for that. It's a question that, or questions along those lines have come up quite a lot over the past couple of weeks, as people can imagine. Let's move on to another issue. We slightly mentioned it already. Martin in Flitwick in Bedfordshire. Hi, Martin. What would you like to ask?
Text.
Oh, it's a text. I do apologise. He says, should HS2 be scrapped? Salma?
No. And simply, it's because I think we do need bigger and better infrastructure. And I think HS2 has been completely dogged by the fact that the government made all the wrong arguments about why we were implementing HS2, and they talked about sort of speed rather than capacity. And I think, let's go back to levelling up. Levelling up is a different name for all the other things that we've had, before that, we had the Northern Powerhouse and the Midlands Engine and all that type of stuff. But the fact is that levelling up means that you've got to put your money where your mouth is, and HS2 is an example of that. And I get that people are upset by this, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people whose lives are going to be uprooted because of where HS2 is going to go.
I suspect Martin is one of them.
Yes, in Flitwick. Yeah. But if you are thinking about capacity and growing the economy and sharing the proceeds of that growth, in the country, then HS2 is a good thing. And I'm
Now,
from Lancashire.
there's a phrase
so
we haven't heard for a long time: sharing the proceeds of growth. Goodness me,
Showing my age.
You're dating yourself now. Andrew, you've already nailed your colours to the mast on this, that you don't think it should be scrapped. But let me play devil's advocate here. Look, after the pandemic, surely the business case has collapsed, in that not as many business people will want to travel between London and Birmingham on the train because they'd be doing it by Zoom. So what's the point? Throwing money down a drain?
Well, I don't think that is the case, but I certainly think that should be addressed in all the dynamics that are behind HS2. I mean, Salma put her finger on an absolutely critical point. It was sold originally as about speed. Going into Birmingham New Street, which serves not directly, but is close to Sutton Coldfield, every day before the pandemic, there were 4,000 people standing on trains, and there is a huge capacity issue. And post-Brexit, if we are to compete with other countries around the world, we have got to have a first-class infrastructure and transport system. So I take your point, that needs to be factored into the calculations, but in the end, if we are to compete and we are to be a modern, thriving, first-world economy, we need modern, thriving, first-world transport and infrastructure.
Sam?
I think we have a panel in complete agreement here, which doesn't happen very often. But HS2 was conceptualized long before I was doing anything to do with politics. But I firmly agree with what Salma said, that anything that is going to be great, anything that will be beneficial for this country will take time and it will take money. It was totally framed in a non accessible way for ordinary people, for working people, for those who necessarily don't travel from London to Birmingham every single day for conferences or meetings. But the additional job opportunities and growth opportunities around HS2 should really be considered and should be brought to the forefront of this debate, because it isn't just about a fast train from London to Birmingham. It's about the additional jobs, it's about the opportunities for bringing more of this metropolitan growth outside of London and into the Midlands. I am from Telford myself, so I love anything that will bring an extra boost to the West Midlands. But I think that we need to consider the great opportunities post-pandemic. This is an opportunity for sweeping reform. This is the opportunity to create new growth, new jobs out post-Brexit, post-pandemic, and bring more opportunities into the home counties.
I'm going to do a really unchivalrous thing now and ask how old you are.
I'm 19 years old.
19.
Yes.
Do you want to be an MP?
I am not sure. I am staunchly opposed.
I do hope so.
I'm staunchly.
Well, there might be a seat in Sutton Coldfield at the minute.
Not until she's a lot older.
I was going to say I'm staunchly opposed to people entering politics for A, the wrong reasons, or B, too early. The lifespan of a politician is so short now. You don't get the Margaret Thatchers who are in politics for 30 odd years. Yeah, you don't get the Andrew Mitchells who fight the good fight for decades and decades. But not to call you old. But I definitely think that anyone that goes into politics should go into it for the right reasons. They should have some sort of experience, and they should have an area of expertise that they can bring something to in the House. So we'll see. But
like my book, you're absolutely,
I was going to say,
absolutely spot on.
You'll have to hook me up with a copy.
Sounds like you've got to read Andrew's book before you finally decide.
The House of Commons should not be a college of further education.
Exactly.
Absolutely put your finger on it. You have to bring something in with you.
Well, someone's just texted, this, Sam, is the best guest you've had on Cross Question in your entire series. No disrespect to our other two.
Shining endorsement.
Well, indeed.
Hopefully it won't be my last time either.
Well, I'm sure it won't. Listen, we are going to lose Salma now because I think she's got a sort of subsequent engagement or something. But,
I do, sadly.
You do. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. She's going to be replaced by Philip Blond, who is the director of a leading right-of-centre think tank, Respublica. So we will see you again very soon, Salma. You were about to leave, weren't you? But somebody sat you down. Let's get the news headlines before we take another question on Cross Question. It's 8:32. Here's Tim Humphrey.
The Chancellor has stressed the need to fix public finances as he hints at further tax rises. Speaking at the Conservative Party conference, Rishi Sunak said recovery from the pandemic comes with a cost. An independent review is going to be carried out into the Metropolitan Police following the murder of Sarah Everard. The Commissioner says it will look into Scotland Yard's culture after a former serving officer was jailed for the crime last week. Thousands of WhatsApp, Instagram and Facebook users have reported issues with the social media platforms. Facebook, which owns them, has apologised and says it's working to fix the problems as soon as possible. The weather, heavy and persistent rain for England and Wales tonight, lows of 7.
Coverage. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36, let me reintroduce my panel to you, or slightly introduce, because Philip Blonder's joined us. He's director of the Respublica think tank, and you've got a new report out this week.
Yes, we have. It's the first report of our Lifetime Education Commission, and we basically argue that the government's approach on skills is right, but we have to universalise it. That what we need is an offer for every citizen over the age of 18 to do the skills or reskilling or new skilling that they need. And given rapid technological change, given how far behind some people are and how burnt they are by education, we've got to give everybody the loan entitlement and the ability to study whatever will advance them in whatever field. And I think that could really revolutionise life for the majority of people in this country.
Well, you never know, we might have a question on it later in the hour. Andrew Mitchell is here, Sam Smith is here, Conservative youth activist and political commentator. Right, David is in Bermondsey. David, what's your question, please? Hi.
Good evening, thanks for having me on. I just wanted to ask, how are we going to reach our net zero targets when we're cancelling current initiatives like the Green Homes Initiative?
Philip, let's start with you.
Well, I think that what we at least have in this country is the ambition, and we also have a massive resource of renewables, and especially wind. There are advantages to being an island, and we have to continue with developing the type of technology that could deliver that. And that, crucially, is, I think, intermediate nuclear, but long term, it's kind of a battery storage at grid level, because without that, intermittent renewables still risk intermittency. And if we can solve grid level battery storage, which theoretically we can, then we can actually run an entirely carbon-free energy system, which at the very least is the beginning. And I think that's where innovation needs to be directed at. The worrying thing, though, I read, is even if we do get to net zero, that won't be enough to stop global warming. That what we actually had to have, I was reading a paper yesterday, is actually geoengineering on quite a large scale to rapidly
What does that mean?
That means apparently seeding sulfates in the air. Apparently that only that will... Yeah.
Goes straight over my head.
It makes the atmosphere whiter. So a serious scientist, he's at MIT, says that unless we do that, even getting to net zero won't stop global warming, which is a worrying thought I had when I read the paper.
Sam?
I know. Well, we recently saw the success of the G7 summit. We are welcoming COP26 very, very soon. I think that the global cooperation is there and the ambition is there, but like Philip said, we need to look for sustainable solutions that will bring us forward into the future. I am not an expert on green initiatives on the Green New Deal by any means, but I do believe that there is a case to be made for sustainable business, for incentivizing net zero contributions, and for incentivizing green alternatives within the economy, within the business, within manufacturing and production, and making these accessible and realistic for many businesses. You can't expect a small production company in Sutton Coldfield to necessarily
She's making a pitch already, you see.
No, she's rightly talking up one of the greatest royal towns in the country.
Here we go.
And a leading location in the West Midlands.
Absolutely.
But back to the question, why is the government removing the Green Homes Grant? Doesn't it send the wrong signal, Andrew?
Well, David, there's good news and there's bad news on this. I mean, the good news is that Britain is doing pretty well on meeting its targets. I mean, the target is only 1%, or slightly less, actually, of the total world need in that respect. But Britain is a leader, and what we need is energy and technology to take the strain, and we need market-based solutions, as Sam has said. So that's the good news. And the other part of the good news is that we have the COP coming up, which is going to cast a magnifying glass on what every country is doing, and in particular, because it's based in Britain, it will be on what Britain is doing. And I think that is going to show two things. First of all, it's going to test British leadership, which, since we've slashed our development spending, has sent a lot of bad signals around the world in terms of that British leadership, which, coming up to the COP, is, in my view, won't surprise you to hear me say, Iain, a big mistake. But the COP26 will show people of Sam's generation whether or not Britain and the world is serious in tackling this. And you know, all the evidence is out there. If we don't make these decisions now, then we are bequeathing the next generation with a terrible legacy.
David, let me come back to you. Just answer your own question. Why do you think the government's removed the Green Homes Grant? They would say it's because the system wasn't working, I suppose.
It was. I'm a building surveyor, and I was actively encouraging people to do it. And people were actually putting it further up their list of to-dos in their homes, because it wasn't just the financial burden on them. They saw it as a partnership with the government to put right the leakiest houses in Europe.
So why is the government doing it?
I don't know. I think it's empty rhetoric. We're never going to hit these lofty goals if we don't take the small steps. Insulation is a good one. New boilers, new double glazing. These are the basics we need to do before thinking about transforming our entire national grid. We were doing it this year up until March 31st. There was money on the table for houses to do it, and it was taken away with no replacement, and we've got COP26 coming. And Andrew was quite right, the removal of the international development budget was a stain on the whole of the UK.
Don't get
like
him
this green
started on that,
initiative
David.
needs to be changed. But it is.
Yeah,
It is.
well, I agree
Gosh,
with
you have brilliant questioners on your
We
programme.
do every day. David, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to another brilliant questioner. I hope it's Norman in Dartford. Hello, Norman.
Hello, Ian.
Hi.
Yeah, what I'd like to ask, should the police stay away from the Insulate Britain protesters and let the public deal with it, as they did on Wandsworth Bridge today?
Should the police stay away from the Insulate Britain protesters and let the public deal with them, as they apparently did on Wandsworth Bridge? Sam?
I think it's interesting that the Met Police are perfectly happy to police certain protests but not others. When we look at the Insulate Britain protests, I don't see a group of legitimate protesters. I see a group of criminals who are being allowed to carry on with reckless, criminal and damaging behaviour, damaging to their own cause, damaging to the general populace, damaging to the flow of British society. I mean, we saw the devastating scenes from Wandsworth Bridge, I believe it was, or the M26, with a woman who was begging Insulate Britain protesters to move out of the way to allow her elderly mother to go to hospital. This is not the aim of climate protesters. This is not a true climate protest. This is a thinly veiled excuse for anarchy. And I applaud those civilians who stepped in, who took matters into their own hands where the police once again have failed, and moved the protesters out of the way. It's perfectly defensible to suggest that those who were moving protesters out, preventing them from committing crimes, should
It's
be...
technically assault, though.
Is it not technically...
I mean, given that you're, I think, studying law, I mean, that if you lay, believe me, I know from previous experiences, which we don't need to go into tonight, but if you lay your hands on someone, you don't have to be violent, you just have to lay your hands on someone and try and move them, and that technically, under the law, is assault.
But isn't it also technically able to be protected if someone is preventing another crime from being committed? If these protesters have been sat in the road for hours and hours, disrupting the flow of traffic, potentially putting themselves and others at risk, would it not be a legitimate defence to suggest that these civilians who are simply trying to get on with their days...
Well, you try that one out in a court of law and see if it works. Andrew?
Well, first and foremost, the answer is no. It is a matter for the police to handle these things, and the police must enforce the law without fear or favour in an absolutely impartial and open and transparent way. So that would be my answer to the question. But in terms of the protests, it is completely counterproductive for the cause which they are trying to support, because it just alienates the public and annoys and irritates the public and puts back the cause which they believe in. So on every basis, they shouldn't do it, and if they do it, the police should move in and assert the law of the land.
Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with my fellow panellists. I'm like Andrew, completely puzzled as to what the ideology behind these protesters are. If they want public support, they don't stop people going to hospital. I mean, it's bizarre. I don't really understand the ideology that lies behind it. But again, I'm struck by how inept our current policing is. It's like they lack ideological direction, they lack clear principle, and they don't seem to be able to act properly. And it's just very odd, and it speaks, I think, to some sort of genuine crisis that really, again, I find relatively inexplicable.
OK, Norman, thank you very much for that. 0345 6060 973. More from Andrew Mitchell, Philip Blond and Samantha Smith in just a few moments. It's 8:46.
This is
property in your area.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Andrew Mitchell, Samantha Smith and Philip Blond still with us. Alex in Watford has a question. Hi, Alex.
Good evening, panel. What is the panel's view on the Prime Minister's expenditure since coming to power, as Margaret Thatcher is turning in her grave?
So what's the view regarding the Prime Minister's expenditure since coming to power? I mean, I'm assuming you mean government expenditure in general rather than Boris Johnson's personal expenditure. Although, I suppose the jury's out on that one. Andrew, you served as an MP when Margaret Thatcher was in power. Obviously, we are in very, very different circumstances. Do you think the Conservative Party has sort of recognised that things are very different now, or is this still going to be a sort of like Thatcherite wet versus dry argument on public expenditure again?
Well, I think things are very different from the earlier period which Alex described. I mean, we've had this global pandemic and the government has rightly put its arms round jobs and families and a very, very concerned
unless you're
population.
Self-employed.
But even to some extent around them, obviously, indirectly though in that case, and spent £400 billion. And that money will have to be repaid, and it's essential that the Chancellor satisfies the markets that it's going to be repaid. And our colleague and friend David Davis had an extremely sensible argument in the paper this weekend about what you do with that, and you treat it like a war bond and you put it to one side. So the Chancellor has to be clear that he's got a plan for dealing with that, and that special circumstances require special measures. But what we're not changing our party's support for taxing as low as possible, consistent with having proper funding for great public services. And it was Churchill who said that we want a society in which people can grow to their full extent, but one also which ensures that there's a safety net below which people cannot fall, and that should be the Conservative philosophy on this.
Philip, I can remember in the early days of the Thatcher government big debates about whether public spending was getting out of control when there was a deficit of £2 billion. How times change. But do you think this is one of those issues that could start to be a very divisive one within the Conservative Party, where some people will recognise that after COVID the state is going to have to play a much bigger role? And in a way, I mean, your think tank has been looking at these issues over many, many years, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, look, we couldn't just continue with the class-divided society that we live in. We live in a Britain that is arguably the most divided society in the developed world, where if you're poor, you roughly live 20 years less than somebody who's wealthy, and of the years you do live, you live in ill health. Unless we address the persistent grinding penalty of class, which is really the largest penalty in this country by miles, far more than race, far more than gender, it's class. Now, what's interesting, the great shift is the Conservative Party is now the party of the working class, which I've long argued for. So it's got to speak to those people. It's got to...
But just on that, because some people, when they hear you say that, they will issue a hollow laugh. But if you look at the statistics from the last election, 47% of so-called working class voters voted Conservative, 32% voted Labour. So that's what the claim is based on.
Yeah, and with that as their reality, what is the Conservative policy offer for people who've been structurally abandoned for generations? What is it? Is it, no, we're going to continue abandoning you and we're going to continue to look after people in the southeast and upper middle class people? Is that the offer? No, it can't be. So the only offer has to be to invest at scale. But here's the rub. Everything pays off if you take out debt, but you invest in something productive. Now, I've long thought that welfare isn't productive, and we need some form of productive welfare. Asset welfare is productive. That's what middle class people have and working class people don't, is assets. So we've got to find a way to put that public expenditure into something transformative for people. And I've long thought that has to be a combination of assets such as housing, wealth, but education. And unless we can invest in them at scale, everything's going to stay the same. And that Tory majority will evaporate. So I welcome the fact that for the first time we have a realisation that we've got to serve the working class people of this country. Labour's dominated by a metropolitan elite that into the cul-de-sac of sexual identity politics. So this is the great transformative moment for Boris Johnson. Can he become the Disraeli of the 21st century? Can he actually tackle the two nations that we have in this country? And if he can, then that will be something for which the debt that we currently have is worth having.
That would be quite ironic, wouldn't it, if he ended up being Disraeli rather than Churchill?
Yes.
Sam?
I agree with Philip that now is a transformative moment in this government. We haven't really had the chance to see what the stuff they're made of is. With the pandemic, they've almost been just trying to help us survive, help every sector survive in the best way possible. And it would be foolish to think that anyone doesn't understand the behemoth task that the government was faced with during the pandemic. Borrowing has skyrocketed. The Chancellor has said that we cannot allow borrowing to continue. We cannot continue to see the public purse as an infinite sack of money from which to throw to public services. But I also believe that in order to appeal to a wider demographic, as Philip was saying, we cannot go back on conservative values. Rather than redefining what it is to be a conservative, we need to appeal to a wider audience and show those who lent us their vote in 2019 that conservatism can work for them as we forge a path post-pandemic. We need, rather than hiking taxes exponentially with no end date, we need to put in place infrastructure that is going to cost money. None of this comes cheap, none of it is free, but we need to put in place forward-thinking schemes and initiatives like the Kickstart scheme, like the bounce back loans, to allow businesses to pick themselves up rather than relying on welfare, on furlough, on these government schemes that do have an end date, unfortunately.
Now, there's some very raucous Conservatives in this hall. We thought we'd ejected them earlier on, but they have come back, so if you can hear lots of clapping. They're not clapping us, unfortunately, Andrew Mitchell, are they?
They might be.
Well, they might be, I suppose. Alex, thank you very much indeed for your question. A text from Jean in Driffield, who says, what alternative to Keir Starmer would scare you as a Conservative, as an opposition leader? Who is the big threat? Andrew?
Well, and I think that it's a mistake to look at the leader. The problem the Labour Party has got is that they don't know where they're going. But I think Jess Phillips would be a very good leader of the Labour Party.
That's funny. I agree with you. She's the only one that I think strikes fear into the heart of a Conservative MP.
And she's got good, she's a good, sensible Brummie who knows a thing or two about life and writes very good books. So she's a fellow author.
Philip?
I think what would most strike fear into the heart of a Tory MP is a Labour Party that was socially conservative. Now,
that's interesting.
Now, what that would be, and who is that there? John Cruddas used to represent that, and I always felt if
Frank Field.
Yeah, I always felt if John Cruddas and John MacDonald had found a way to work together, that would have been lethal for the Conservative Party. Because I long argued that the country needs to move left in terms of left economically, right socially, in terms of the mix where people were. Too many people were economically marginalised, and too many people had their lives and their families being broken up and made insecure. And I think if the Labour Party did that and stopped all this nonsense about focusing on race or sexuality or anything like that and spoke to that, then they'd be dangerous.
Sam? Oh, actually, no, I'm going to press you for a name. Who do you think should replace Keir Starmer if that happened?
I think an amalgam between MacDonald and Cruddas. Now, that's in the genome.
All right,
that's what I'll offer.
Neither of them are going to get it. Sam?
No.
I think what would strike fear into a Conservative's heart more than anything would be a Labour Party that isn't intent on destroying itself from the inside out. It's interesting to see that those who are popular among the voting base of the Labour Party would be absolutely abysmal leaders, and I myself fear the day that the Zara Sultanas of the world reach any point of political influence beyond the realm of social media. But I think that Jess Phillips would be a sensible alternative for leadership, since Keir Starmer has seemingly not been supported by either factions of his own party since the very beginning.
Can I just add something? Apparently at the Labour Party conference there was a discussion in the hall about whether or not they should have, for the next Labour leader, an all-women shortlist. and a voice at the back said, "Nah, but Jeremy will still win."
I suspect not. Right, final text. Gladys in Northampton. There's been chaos after Facebook, WhatsApp and Instagram have suffered an outage today. Which app could you not live without, Sam?
I don't know whether it's just me. Everyone I've spoken to seems to be reliant on WhatsApp, but I personally use text. I love an old-fashioned phone call. I love text. I don't really use Facebook. For me, Twitter is where it's at. Twitter and text. It's the future.
Well, you've attracted a fair few Twitter comments tonight. I'd leave it a bit before you look at some of them,
Okay.
if you would. Philip?
I'm Twitter and text as well. Yeah, it's the future.
Kindred spirits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andrew, you're not on Twitter, are you?
No, I'm not. But I tell you my answer. I have a Scottish grandmother, so WhatsApp, it saves so much money. And I really, I've noticed that they were down. I thought I was alone in being targeted.
Was that a pseudo-racist comment you just made?
No. I'm a quarter Scots, But
Me too.
Canny with the funds, and WhatsApp is a way of communicating with anyone around the world without having to pay. I think it's wonderful.
So you're not quarter Yorkshire as well, by any chance? I think we'll leave that.
It depends whether I managed to find, when I was fighting Sunderland South, I managed to find a relative who'd worked in the shipyards there. So most candidates, it's an important point for Sam, when they're going for a seat somewhere in the country, will be able to find some sort of family link.
Well, it's been great to have all of you on. Philip Blonde, Andrew Mitchell, Sam Smith, thank you very much. And your book is called again?
It's called Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey.
And you will be on the programme on the 28th of October, along with your former Labour colleague, I think constituency neighbour as well at one point, Jeff Hoon.
Yes,
he's got memoirs coming out, so we're going to have you do a bit of a double act.
He's an old friend of mine, and there's a story about the two of us at Twycross Zoo, which I hope will make you laugh.
Oh my goodness, the mind boggles. In a moment, we are going to be talking about what I think is going to be the new dividing line in British politics, and it's this: vote Tory and get a pay rise, vote Labour and get mass immigration and depressed wages. It's very crude in a sense, but it could be very effective. I want to test it out on you over the next hour. What do you think of that? Is that something where you think, well, Boris Johnson might be onto something there? 0345 6060 973. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Labour's accusing the Chancellor of being in denial about the scale of the country's economic crisis. In a speech to his party's conference, Rishi Sunak defended a decision